Hey, true crime fans, welcome back to For Criming Out Loud and our bedtime series called Crime Me to Sleep. We've been reading Buried Beneath the Boarding House, and this is episode 13. So if you're new here, make sure you subscribe and go into the playlist so you can start the book from the very beginning. Let's get into episode 13 of Buried Beneath the Boarding House. Dearly Missed. In October of 1988, just a few days after Bert's disappearance, Judy showed up at the house unannounced, looking for him. Her emotional connection to the man hadn't diminished just because Dorothea had forged such a close relationship with Bert, and she liked to stop in from time to time just to see how he was doing. She was dismayed to find that Bert was nowhere to be seen. The other residents shied away from answering any questions, most of them heading off to their rooms when Judy arrived, and it was only when Dorothea finally emerged from the sanctuary of her kitchen that Judy got an explanation. Bert had taken ill, and he was laid up in his bed and sleeping right now. It was nothing serious, nothing to worry about, and Dorothea promised that she was taking the very best care of her boy. Something about the delivery of that lie sounded off to Judy, whether it was the lack of sorrow in Dorothea's voice or the attempts to garner secondhand sympathy and praise by listing off all the things that she was doing for Bert. Judy made a note to herself to check up on Bert as soon as possible. When her schedule over the following days prevented this, Judy got in touch with Peggy Nickerson, Bert's social worker, and asked her to investigate the situation. At first, Peggy got the same story as Judy when she phoned asking to speak to Bert. But as the days rolled on, and she still couldn't speak to him, she became increasingly concerned about this illness that had taken a hold of him, and asked Dorothea if he might not be better off in a hospital. The fury and ultimatums that had driven off interference from the detox center workers wouldn't work against an official from the social work department. Dorothea had to think fast, never her strong suit, and the lie that she had concocted was as simple as it was stupid. Bert was actually feeling much better, and he had left town. Judy was at Dorothea's door the next day, demanding information. Overnight, Dorothea had concocted a whole new story, and now, with Judy as a waiting audience, she began to spin her web of deceit. After his bout of illness, Bert had been quiet and introspective, regretting his past and longing to mend broken bridges. He'd called up his sister, and the very same day, she and her husband had shown up and taken him away to Mexico with them to visit the rest of his family. With any other volunteer and any other transient, the story might have landed. But Judy knew Bert's story inside and out. She knew he had never been to Mexico in his life, had no family there, and definitely didn't know his sister's phone number. She had spent months trying to track down Bert's sister and had come to believe that the woman was living somewhere outside of the USA. She left without questioning Dorothea's story, but she was certain that the old woman was lying, even if she couldn't work out why. After Judy shared this latest information with Peggy, the social worker began to make regular calls to Dorothea for an update on Bert's location. The family holiday could only stretch on for so many weeks before he would have to come home, so she needed a new story, and this one would require more depth. The next time that Peggy rang, in early November, Dorothea informed her with a fake delight that Bert had decided he wanted to stay with his sister and her husband from now on. They would live together at their house in Utah, and Bert would no longer require any of them to watch over him because he had his beloved family back in his life. Peggy judged this to be implausible and demanded contact details from Dorothea so the story could be corroborated by Bert's family. Backed into a corner, Dorothea claimed that she couldn't just go around giving out phone numbers to strangers, and abruptly terminated the call. If Peggy wasn't suspicious before, now she was certain that something strange was going on in Dorothea's boarding house. She contacted Judy and asked her to start making some inquiries about Dorothea to see what the people on the street knew about her, trying to gauge exactly what kind of trouble poor Bert might have gotten himself into. But before that investigation could get any further, Peggy received a call in her office that should have set her mind at ease. Dorothea had always had a network of ready bodies to call on in the lowest caste of society. Every transient, ex-cons, and addict knew her name, and that she was good for a few bucks here and there if you were willing to put in some work. Donald Anthony was just one of the many men that she had hired to do odd jobs throughout the years, and while he had never lived under her roof, the halfway house that he spent his nights in was just a few streets away. He was a convenient voice for her to put on the phone. Unfortunately for Dorothea, you get what you pay for when it comes to voice actors, and while Donald successfully delivered the news that Bert was going to be staying with him and his wife, Bert's sister, he used the name Bert repeatedly on the call, even though his family would have had no reason to call him that. When he was signing off, he actually said his own name instead of the false one that Dorothea had provided to him. This call was the straw that broke the camel's back. Dorothea's behavior had gone from odd to outright suspicious. It took only a few minutes of calling around for Peggy to learn the identity of her prank caller and his connection to Dorothea, and it took her even less time to decide what she had to do next. She called the police. It was entirely luck that the call was patched through to Detective John Cabrera, the only man in the Sacramento Police Department who had ever led the hunt for a serial killer before, hunting Morris Solomon less than a year before, and uncovering the pattern of murders that would convict that handyman of the murder of 6 women across the city. It seemed to Cabrera that this was probably just a case of confusion rather than anything more sinister. Still, he went out to do his due diligence, arranging to visit the boarding house that day to interview Dorothea and her guests and get to the bottom of the missing persons case, where the person had already been repeatedly accounted for. At the house, Dorothea had all of her guests out on display, laughing, smoking, and playing games in the communal areas. Snacks were being circulated, and the landlady seemed to have returned to her former friendly disposition. For the few long-term guests, this was a wonderful return to form, and they wouldn't even consider looking the gift horse in the mouth. For the newer guests, it was a new treat to be handled with such kindness by Dorothea, whom they all knew had been in a bit of a slump ever since Bert had left. It all seemed very pleasant, but Cabrera knew the dark secrets that could hide under a well-maintained exterior. He took each of the guests to a separate room and interviewed them. Even in the privacy of their own rooms, none of the guests deviated from the story that Dorothea had provided, although a few of them did cast nervous glances towards the door, half expecting somebody to come bursting in if they said the wrong thing. In itself, it wasn't enough for Cabrera to cause any more trouble, but it did make him discount the idea that nothing untoward was happening in the house. One of the last residents to be interviewed was John Sharp, an alcoholic who had been under Dorothea's care for the longest of any of them. In his interview with Cabrera, he towed the party line carefully, reciting the story of Bert's journey to Mexico and then Utah verbatim, and praising Dorothea loudly enough that it made the detective wonder if the old woman had her ear pressed to the door. When it became obvious that he wasn't going to get anything useful from Sharp, Cabrera was ready to leave empty-handed, but before he could step out into the hallway, the man reached over and shook that empty hand, slipping a tiny handwritten note into the officer's palm. Cabrera pocketed it quickly before saying his goodbyes to Dorothea, who was all smiles, knowing that her deception had gone off without a hitch this time. Out in his car, parked up the street, Cabrera finally opened up the little note that Sharp had passed him. It was succinct. She is making us lie for her. Later in the day, when Sharp made his regular trip to the store for cigarettes, Cabrera pulled up and offered him a lift. That soon turned into a stop at a cafe, so the two of them could have a little chat. In the intervening hours, Cabrera had looked into Sharp's history and confirmed that the man had no particular grudge against Dorothea that he might be now trying to air. It seemed that the man was legitimate. His story was fragmented and unclear at first, just little snippets of odd events that only took on sinister undertones when the whole picture emerged. Stories about holes being dug in the gardens and filled in again overnight, about the concrete poured out without any real reason to be laying concrete, one or two instances where guests took sick and then moved up the stairs into Dorothea's rooms before vanishing in the night, just as surely as the holes in the gardens did, all underlain with the sickly sweet scent of rot, blamed on the drains, on the rats, on the fish emulsion on the lawn. A dozen little excuses why the people couldn't be reached. A dozen petty complaints about letters being opened if they looked like they might contain a check. Dorothea's extravagant spending, her perfumes and top-shelf liquor. A tapestry of individual threads that meant nothing but that could be wound together to create a very suspicious-looking picture. It was enough to launch a more thorough investigation into Dorothea, one that soon turned up the full breadth of her criminal history, stretching all the way back to her original prostitution charges. That was all ancient history as far as Cabrera was concerned, but the more recent charges, the drugging and robbery, the forging and the fraud, those all pointed to a more dangerous situation in the boarding house. He contacted Dorothea's parole officer and discovered the legal prohibitions against her maintaining the boarding house. More threads were woven into the tapestry, and the picture looked more and more sinister with each passing minute. Collecting the parole officer and a few good men in uniform, Cabrera headed back to the house on F Street with shovels in the back seat. It was the 11th of November, 1988. He didn't have enough for a warrant, not yet. He might be able to force the closure of the boarding house if it came to it, but he was hoping that it wouldn't be necessary, given how charming Dorothea was and how content the other residents seemed to be. If he could search the house and find nothing else that inflamed his suspicion, then he might be able to walk away and let everyone get on with their lives in peace. That was a big if. When they arrived at Dorothea's boarding house, she welcomed them all in and offered them coffee. If there was anything that she could do to help give them comfort to the people who were worried about her precious Bert, she'd be delighted to help in any way that she could. She led them to his room, as yet unlet, and offered them free rein to search the whole house. They took her up on it. With Dorothea hovering around them, they didn't feel comfortable tearing the whole place up, but even so, Cabrera was able to add a few more concerning threads to his tapestry of guilt. The books that Dorothea had lying around about the properties of drugs, with dog-eared pages relating to many of the medications that she had used in the past for her drugging and robberies. The house was cluttered with knickknacks and doilies that would have been unexpected or would have been expected in the home of the elderly woman that Dorothea had been pretending to be. But with her new facelift and her false teeth in place, she no longer matched the appearance that she had been using as a mask this whole time. Among the many prescription medications in her name, hidden away in her room behind her extravagant perfumes and makeup, there was a single bottle labeled for Dorothy Miller. When Cabrera asked her about it, Dorothea explained that Dorothy, her sister-in-law, had come to visit and must have left the bottle behind. It was a logical enough explanation, but it still rang false to Cabrera. After a few hours, they had been through the whole house, with no evidence worse than an unpleasant smell lingering around her bedroom, which she attributed to a dead rat beneath the floorboards, and feigned embarrassment about. They had nothing at all to go on beyond that one misplaced drug bottle. It was enough for Cabrera. He pushed his luck and asked for Dorothea's permission to have a dig around in her garden, concerned that some evidence may have been lost when Dorothea buried trash out there, as she claimed to have. It would have been quite reasonable for her to refuse, and the police would have no recourse. There was nowhere near the amount of evidence that would have been required to get a warrant for them to dig up the garden. And her well-known pride in that garden would have provided her with the perfect excuse to refuse them. But there would still be suspicion. If she had refused, every one of the policemen on her doorstep would go away with the seed of doubt about her innocence planted in their minds, and she couldn't abide that. She couldn't live in a world where people thought that she was a killer. It didn't fit with the stories she told about herself and to herself. She had lived in her own fantasy for so long that it's hard to say whether she truly believed that when the police went digging in her garden, there would be nothing to find, or if she had just greatly overestimated her ability to cover her tracks. Either way, she didn't just give the police permission to dig in the fresh, turned soil of her yard, but she also gave them her shovel, since they hadn't brought along enough for everybody. Cabrera started by the new tree and the freshest patch of churned-up earth, hoping for a quick win and an early end to the day. It was slow going. As he went, the first of the buried trash began to surface. Scraps of cloth, little bits of plastic wrapper, something that looked a lot like leather but, on closer examination, revealed to have a texture like beef jerky. The deeper the men dug, the more bits and pieces of this buried trash heap were dragged up and out onto the lawn. Eventually, it seems they hit an impasse. There was some tough tree root down at the bottom of their excavation, and nobody could shift it, no matter how hard they hacked with the blades of their shovels. It fell to the lead detective himself to fling himself in the hole and pull at the thick root with all of his strength. Wiping sweat and flecks of the beef jerky from his face, Cabrera locked his arms around the root and strained his whole body, back arching with effort, and the buttons of his muddied shirt threatening to shoot off. For one long moment, they waited in silence, the only sound being Cabrera's grunts and puffs. Then the root gave way, and he fell back into the mud, a human shin bone still grasped between his aching fingers. He scrambled out of the hole, dropping the remains behind him, his heart hammering in his chest. The sweat of his efforts washed away in a cold sluice of terror. There was a dead body in the ground. He had been pulling at a leg. He had torn a leg from a corpse. The other police pressed forward, and a gasp rolled out amongst them. When the, quote, root had disappeared into the earth before, they could now clearly see a foot in a shoe, hauled up out of the earth by Cabrera's efforts. They turned as one to Dorothea and were startled at the rictus of shock on her face, grossly exaggerated by her massive glasses and the hands pressing at her already hollowed cheeks. She looked like a caricature version of somebody who was shocked more than she did a real person. That wraps up episode 13 of Buried Beneath the Boarding House. If you're enjoying this bedtime book series, please hit the like button. It helps the channel so much. Thank you guys for being here. I really appreciate your support in our series, Crime Me to Sleep. Until next time, good night.